Okay, so the purpose of this session is for us to continue our journey in relation to the way in which we both use and derive energy, that is, from substrates to do work. So this week what we're going to look at is the next stage in this process, which is what we refer to as glycolytic substrate metabolism. That is energy that is derived from a substrate in the form of carbohydrate, which is either stored in the muscle, which is glycogen, or which we can derive and pull from the bloodstream, which would be in the form of glucose. And we're going to look at how we use this under anaerobic conditions. So, the session today is going to initially look at the processes involved in substrate metabolism during exercise beyond 6 seconds. So remember, in the previous session we studied what ATP is as a molecule, and we recognised that ATP is the currency for muscles to change length, and that it in fact is the only currency that we can use for a muscle to change length. We then recognised that in order to resynthesize ATP, because we've only got enough for a single muscular contraction, we have to then make use of a high energy phosphate source, which is phosphocreatine. And that allows us to continue exercise at that same output for around about 6 seconds. But we also observed that exercise beyond 6 seconds, we start to see a decrement in the amount of output, that is the physical work that's been undertaken. And the reason for that is that the PCR stores will be dropping, but you're trying to maintain the exercise intensity. So the result is that we then have to rely on a new source of energy to supplement the ATP provision. Now, what we're next going to move on to is look at the chemical and molecular processes involved in the generation of this ATP from glycolysis, this glycolytic substrate metabolism. So we're looking at this idea that we're hitting around about 6 seconds of maximum intensity exercise. We're trying to maintain the same output. We're now going to rely on this secondary source to help resynthesize or generate ATP, and that is through these glycolytic sources. And then the final part is to address the concept of lactic acid and its production and its association with substrate utilisation and performance. Now, lactic acid is bandied around as being a byproduct, and in many instances it's referred to as being, in inverted commas, harmful or detrimental to performance. So we need to address this. We need to look at how it's formed, why it's formed is terribly important within this, and then understand how this relates to what happens in a game of soccer. Okay, so let's look at this graph we've got here on the right. So what we've got is we've got exercise intensity, and it's a percentage of VO2 max. Well, it doesn't matter really what that is, but if you imagine that VO2 max, 100% VO2 max would be the final score you'd reach on something like a bleep test. So anything beyond that, then we're working anaerobically, because the bleep test is a measure of your maximal oxygen uptake. So it's the maximum amount of ATP that could be generated from using oxidative sources. So anything beyond that, as we can see on this graph, it goes up to 150%, would be using anaerobic energy. What we can additionally see is we can see the phosphocreatine content, we can see the muscle ATP content, and we can see the muscle lactate content. Now, what we see is that the phosphocreatine content shows a fairly uniform linear response to exercise intensity. I remember I said on the previous session that we still use PCR even under aerobic conditions. And you can see that this is the case here, that even at the onset of exercise, some of the energy is going to be supplemented through the donation of the high energy phosphates. But what you can see that's quite important, there's, irrespective of the intensity, is the ATP concentration near enough stays the same, particularly under the aerobic conditions. We're starting to see a decrease beyond VO2 max, but it's pretty well being maintained. The third thing you can see is this muscle lactate. Now, I'm sure many of you have come across lactate in your professional world, but lactate is produced in the muscle cell, and it is a consequence of the use of anaerobic metabolism. But it is not being produced when PCR dominates. It's being produced through glycolytic pathways. Now, worth noting that right at the beginning, even under resting conditions, you can see there is a lactate score. And that is because even under resting conditions, a small amount of the energy that's being used in that resting state is coming from anaerobic metabolism. It's not all coming under aerobic conditions. But you can see that as the intensity increases, we rely more and more on glycolytic metabolism. We know that because the lactate concentration is increasing. You can see this curved-like response for the relationship between exercise intensity and lactate production. But all the time, we appear to be maintaining the ATP concentration. Okay, so let's just have a look at this in terms of the substrates. Now we've seen this in a different form on the previous week. This is from the Gaston paper that I've referred to before. But you can see here we've got exercise duration. So we know that if it's a short duration, it's going to be high intensity. If it's long duration, it's going to be lower intensity. And if we look on the graph, what you'll see is short duration, high intensity, ATP PC. If we then move down from there and the duration starts to increase, you see that glycolysis starts to become an important factor here. And in fact, the glycolysis, although it yields a lower energy output, can actually be maintained for a prolonged period of time. And here we're talking about potentially, certainly using it for 300 seconds, but not predominating. Notice that even after about 50 seconds, aerobic metabolism starts to kick in. Now this graph is quite important to us. It suggests to us, as we've talked about on previous sessions, that the ATP capacity is limited. We know that the amount of power that can be produced is very high, that the capacity is limited. There are limited stores. But you can also see that the capacity to work glycolytically is limited. Now the question to ask is it limited because we haven't got a big enough store of glycogen, which is the substrate that we're going to use, or glucose, or is it limited for another reason? So we'll have a look at that and try and work out why it is we can't sustain glycolysis for beyond really 50 seconds as a predominant energy source. We're clearly still using it, you can see that, but it's not predominating beyond 50 seconds of maximum intensity exercise. And so we need to deduce the reason why that is the case. This graph is a nice schematic for you. So if you look, we've got on our axis, we've got the ATP production, but we've got how much of that ATP is coming from PCR, and how much of that ATP production is coming from glycolysis. And what we've got across our x-axis are time frames. So for example, 0 to 1.3 seconds, 0 to 2.6 seconds, a bit further along, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. And of course, what you notice is that when it's very short duration, high intensity exercise, then the predominant amount of ATP, there's a significant amount of ATP, we can see that, it's far greater than any others, but it's coming from predominantly PCR. So the ATP production is very high. But when we go to a longer duration, to double it, you notice now that if you take the total amount of ATP, so the total amount of ATP for 1.3 seconds worth of work is, let's call that 2.3 millimoles from PCR and 0.5 millimoles from glycolysis. That gives us 2.8. If we take now 2.6 seconds, can you see it's about 1 millimole from glycolysis, and we'll call that 1.8 from PCR. So again, we've got a score of 2.8. If we go down to say 30 seconds though, look, can you see that at 30 seconds, even though it's short duration, that it's 0.5 from glycolysis and about, let's call that 0.1 from PCR. So in other words, less ATP being produced anaerobically. anaerobically. So even if we go to our mid-range, 5 seconds, we've got just about 1 millimole coming from our glycolysis, and we've got just about, let's call that 1.7 coming from PCR. So the total amount of ATP under the very short duration conditions where, remember, where there is very little aerobic contribution, the total amount of ATP being produced is identical. But what is changing is the relative contribution to that from PCR that we looked at previously and glycolysis. So we can see that even though PCR isn't limited to until about 6 seconds, that we can see a steady rise in the relative contribution to the ATP production from glycolysis. So it does suggest to us that the peak power is always going to be produced in the first couple of seconds, and that beyond that it's very hard to maintain maximal power outputs, and that's because the PCR store capacity is starting to decrease. So we supplement that using glycolysis. But once we get to about 30 seconds, the total ATP coming anaerobically has decreased enormously. And the reason why is that we're now, even at 30 seconds, we're actually having to supplement quite enormously another additional probably 2 millimoles worth here from aerobic pathways. So even though it's still short duration, you can see where the vast majority is coming from. Now if we think about this in terms of soccer, and we said that the average sprint distance is anywhere between 2 and 4 seconds, you can see that even if it's a 2-second sprint, that a large amount of energy is coming from PCR, but a significant amount is coming from glycolysis and the associated byproducts that we're about to look at. So let's get into this then, what we mean by glycolysis and what we mean by being anaerobic and how we generate ATP, and importantly, how many ATP do we generate? Okay, well, let's set the benchmark. Let's set the rules before we do this, and let's have a look at an overview of the principles of substrate metabolism. Well, the first thing is this: if we take a muscle contraction, ATP is used to allow the cross-bridge cycling between the actin and myosin filaments. So remember, the only currency that we have to enable a muscle to change length is adenosine triphosphate. So we've recognised that we've only got enough ATP for a single muscular contraction, that we can then resynthesize that instantaneously to maintain the same power output through PCR, but the PCR stores are limited. So we have to then find alternate means of providing ATP for the muscle to change length. So ATP concentrations are low, we've referred to that. So we know that the PCR stores in muscle are used, but again, the stores are those, actually in the grand scale of thing, the capacity, if you go back to the previous lecture, and I put some data up for you from Hex Group, and they referred to the capacity, and they said low capacity but high power that can be generated. So we know that the PCR stores are relatively low, hence why you can't maintain high intensity exercise for prolonged periods of time. So if we have an increasing number of contractions, the PCR concentration starts to decline. And we saw that, didn't we, on the previous graphs, where you could see in relation to exercise intensity or duration, PCR concentration starts to fall. So as that starts to fall, and assuming you want to maintain the same exercise intensity, there's a need to start to want to utilise alternate fuels or sources to help to regenerate or resynthesize ATP. So consequently what happens is, in this situation, which is common to every individual, as PCR starts to fall, muscle glycogen is called upon. And this leads to what we refer to as an increased flux through the glycolytic pathway with the formation of pyruvate and ATP. Wow, what do we mean by that then? Well, an increased flux just merely means that the process of glycolysis speeds up. So it goes quicker. And it's going quicker because you are trying to, biologically, you are trying to maintain the same output at the muscle. You're trying to keep the muscle lengthening and shortening at the same rate. The end product is what we want, it's ATP. But we also produce an additional chemical, and that is pyruvate. And pyruvate, as you'll see, is terribly important to us. And understanding why pyruvate is produced really helps to understand about the whole process of glycolysis and substrate metabolism. So, just summarise that up very quickly in your own minds. We've got enough ATP for muscle contraction. We can use PCR instantaneously to maintain the same power output, but we can only maintain that for 6 seconds. It's depleted within 10. So at 6 seconds, we start to supplement the energy provision through an additional source to maintain the power output, which is glycolysis, the use of glycogen, the subsequent production of ATP and pyruvate. So, what does it look like? Well, it looks like you see here. This is a schematic of the process, or the biochemical processes that are involved in the breakdown of, in this case, glucose, or as you can see further down, glycogen. So let's have a look at what we're seeing here. So we can see that we've got a number of stages. We start with the glucose molecule, and you can see the glucose molecule right at the top, and you know it's glucose because you can count the number of hydrogens and oxygens on it. Okay, so it's C6H12O6. Now, what have we got? Well, we've got a number of stages of breakdown, and here we are looking at the first 3 stages of breakdown. Now, remember in previous weeks I said to you that in order for a chemical reaction to take place, it takes place in the presence of an enzyme. And here our enzymes are quite clear for us. Our enzymes are the writing, which is in the purple writing surrounded by the yellow border. So, for example, to convert glucose, which is our starting molecule, so glucose is a form of carbohydrate. If we start with glucose, then the process of breakdown from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate takes place in the presence of the enzyme hexokinase. If you then want to convert glucose 6-phosphate, glycogen to glucose 6-phosphate, so in other words, if you don't start with glucose but start with glycogen, then that takes place in the presence of phosphorylase. So we've got these enzymes that are being used, and you can see the other one, which is phosphofructokinase, which I'll talk to you about in a moment because that's a very important one for us. Now, if we look, what we can see is we're starting to see the process of glycolysis, and what we're looking at here is the breakdown of carbohydrates. So glucose and glycogen are both forms of carbohydrate. It's just carbohydrate in the shape, if it's glucose, stored in the bloodstream. If it's glycogen, stored in the muscle. And the end product is twofold. It's the production of ATP and it's the production of pyruvate. And the pyruvate is fundamentally important to our understanding here. So the process, as I've just referred to, is either going to begin with glucose, which is coming from the circulation into the muscle, or it's going to start with glycogen. Both of them will produce ATP. What's different is the amount of ATP that's being produced. Now, I'm going to talk to you through this in the idea of using glucose as our starting point. But what I want you to remember and recognise is that the system is using both glucose and glycogen simultaneously. What's changing is the relative contribution of glucose and glycogen. That under purely anaerobic conditions, we're going to be using glycogen because it's in the cytosol of the cell. Remember, we talked about this before, that is where in the cytosol the anaerobic reactions take place. So it's going to use the fuel source that is instantly available. And remember, you're trying to maintain a high power output. So it's no good doing anaerobic energy and being in a game situation and biologically the system's going, oh God, I've got to drag the energy out of the circulation, get it into the muscle and then break it down. If it's already in a usable form, which is glycogen, it's quicker. Now, what you can see here is something which I think throws people when they start looking at this process, is if we look, you can see on the left-hand side ATP. And in fact, this occurs twice. But look at it very carefully. You're not producing ATP. You're actually actually using ATP. So to convert glucose to glucose 6-phosphate actually costs us an ATP. And to convert fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-diphosphate costs us an ATP. So before we've done anything, we've gone down 3 stages of breakdown, we're at -2 ATP. In other words, we've gained nothing in terms of what we need, which is ATP. Remember, the whole upshot of this is we're trying to produce ATP to provide energy for the muscle to change length. But it's already cost us 2. So can you see that in the schematic? They're converting, you can see the arrows going from ATP to ADP. So we're starting glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, there's one gone. Fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-diphosphate, there's a second one gone. So we're at -2 ATP. Now note that, of course, if you started with glycogen, which comes in a stage later, by the time you get to fructose 1,6-diphosphate, you'd actually only be at -1 ATP, because you've not had to go from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Now, the other thing to bear in mind here is the enzyme phosphofructokinase. And PFK, as it's abbreviated, has been referred to as the rate-limiting enzyme. The rate-limiting enzyme. So, in order for glycolysis to operate, you have to have PFK. We refer to the fact you have to have enzymes in order for this process to work, but PFK is crucial to this as a process. However, if you were to increase the amount of PFK, you're actually going to increase the rate at which the process takes place. So one of the things we know is that when we expose people to the kind of training that requires the use of anaerobic glycolysis, so that is, we expose them to anaerobic training, fairly long duration reps, maybe 30 seconds upwards, 30 seconds to maybe 180 seconds, that we see increases in PFK. So we don't necessarily get increases in glycogen with that kind of training, but PFK increases, which means that the generation of ATP, because we will produce ATP, despite the fact we're at -2 at this point, and we're -1 from glycogen, the production of ATP will become quicker, because the PFK limits the process. It's this rate-limiting enzyme. If you haven't got PFK, then glycolysis cannot take place, irrespective of whether you've got plenty of glucose or glycogen available. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the start point dictates the number of ATP which are finally derived. So we know that clearly, if I'm starting with glucose, even after 3 stages I'm at -2. If I start a glycogen, after 3 stages I'm at -1. So it's going, because the rest of the process is identical. I should perhaps make that clear. This is only a little bit of the process. There's 10 stages. So the rest of the process is identical. So the end product is we're going to be 1 ATP different from glycogen compared to glucose. Let's have a look at the rest of the process. And here it is. So here we've got the remaining stages 4 to 10. Now, what you'll notice is it's identical, it's a mirror image. And that's because once we get to stage 3, the process just runs, is split into 2, and it runs simultaneously at the same time at the same rate. Now, what can we see? Well, this process works very much on a pay-as-you-go basis. It's a bit like your mobile phones, which are pay-as-you-go. If you pay and donate to it, the process will work. So if you have PFK present, if you have glycogen present, and you have all the enzymes present, then it will work on a pay-as-you-go basis. As long as you donate something to it, the process will work. So what can we see? Well, we can see some really important things here. If we look firstly, we can see that between stages, at stage 7, we now have ATP being produced. But notice it's occurring on both sides of the reaction. So that's 2 ATP being produced. So if we're going from glucose, at this point, the net gain is now 0, because we were -2 after stage 3. So the net gain is now 0. If we come to the bottom, you can see at stage 10, there is an additional 2 ATP being produced. So that means the net gain from glucose, in total, from glycolysis, is 2 ATP. From glycogen, what do you think? How many ATP do you think? Have a work it out in your mind. How many ATP from glycogen? I think that's fairly easy. And of course the answer is there's 3 ATP because we basically have that. We missed that first stage out of the process. What else can we see? Well, something that's really important. You can see at stage 6, you can see what is referred to as NAD, and then a H plus, then NADH, and then they go on both sides to what's called the electron transport chain. Now, I don't necessarily want you to worry about this at this stage, but this has relevance for aerobic metabolism of glucose. Aerobic. Now, why is this important to us? Well, when this process is taking place, we pass these hydrogen ions and they go down the electron transport chain. And we're going to recommend that you watch a video. You'll find the hyperlink on the VLE. A video of what the electron transport chain is and how it works. But the hydrogen ions go down this electron transport chain and subsequently, under aerobic conditions, contribute to a generation of ATP. Now that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we're talking about anaerobic glycolysis, and that suggests to you that this process of glycolysis also works under aerobic conditions, which would be right. But there's something very interesting that's happening here. Remember that I said earlier on that glycolysis has to work will be working at quite a fast rate because you want to produce the energy very quickly. And what subsequently happens is that the hydrogen ions that you see here will be produced and have the capacity, if glycolysis is going quick enough, to be produced quicker than they can be passed to the electron transport chain. In other words, quicker than they can be attached to the NAD, which is a carrier, which is nicotine adenosine dinucleotide. They can't be attached because you're producing them far quicker than you've got carriers available, which means that you can't produce NADH, which is nicotine adenosine dinucleotide hydrogenase, which means they can't go down the electron transport chain. And you're probably all going, yeah, but so what? Why is this important? Well, it's important because hydrogen ions interfere with the ability of the muscle to change length. Remember we talked about the fact that when a muscle changes length, it does so in the presence of calcium ions, and the calcium ions are released from the T-tubular complex. They enter the sarcomere, they attach to the troponin to reveal the tropomyosin. And that bonding of the calcium to the troponin is the bit that opens up that binding site and therefore gives us a space for cross-bridge attachment. Here's the issue. Troponin has an affinity for hydrogen ions that is 238 times greater than its affinity for calcium ions. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, the implications are, if the hydrogen ions are being produced faster than they can go down this electron transport chain, they will end up, in theory, in the muscle cell. If they are in the muscle cell and attached to the binding site, it means you've now got less binding sites for the myosin head to attach to, which means you produce less force, which means you can't run as quickly. So hydrogen ions have a big knock-on effect in terms of force generation and fatigue under anaerobic conditions. However, there is a little get-out clause. And the get-out clause sits at the very bottom of the process. So at the bottom of the process you can see that we get this production, final stage, of pyruvate. But do you notice that next to pyruvate it says lactate, and it's got this reversible reaction sign between lactate and pyruvate. Here's the biologically clever thing. If this process is working quicker than hydrogen ions can go down the electron transport chain to be used in the aerobic generation of ATP, and to prevent them from getting into the muscle fibre too quickly and therefore interfering with the cell, because they basically make the cell more acidic. The get out clause is that they have a very high affinity, that is attachment complex, to pyruvate. So excess hydrogen ions will initially attach to pyruvate, and pyruvate plus hydrogen ion gives you lactate. So as long as you've got pyruvate available, you've got the enzyme that you can see there, which is lactate dehydrogenase, as long as they are available, you will get lactate. And so the end product is that we get lactate being produced under anaerobic conditions. So the whole process is regulated by the enzymes that we talked about, PFK, that we looked at earlier on, which is rate limiting, pyruvate kinase that you can see at the end, for example, and then the big one that we just mentioned, which is this lactate dehydrogenase. The upshot is the formation of ATP, hydrogen ions, and you can see also water is being produced. But I just want to re-emphasize that you're trying to maintain an exercise intensity, so you're going to rely on glycolysis. You're trying to produce ATP at a fast rate. Now, you're going to now produce ATP, but you're going to produce hydrogen ions. If the hydrogen ions get into the cell, the pH of the cell goes down, it becomes more acidic. We know that enzymes do not function well in acidic environments. We know that the hydrogen ions interfere with the troponin-tropomyosin complex within the muscle cell, which prevents bonding of the myosin heads, which would therefore mean that you'd have to recruit more muscle fibres to do the same amount of work. If you're recruiting more muscle fibres, you means you've got glycolysis going at an even faster rate to do the same amount of work, which means you produce more hydrogen ions. So the excess hydrogen ions will attach to pyruvate to give lactate. So lactate, as much as you may think it's a waste product and it's not good, is incredibly beneficial. If you did not produce lactate, you would not be able to sustain exercise intensity, because the hydrogen ions would just interfere with the cell functioning by causing changes in pH and temperature, and by interfering with the machinery, that's the tropomyosin complex within the muscle cell. So it become incredibly debilitating if you've got excess hydrogen ions being produced. So very quickly then, how do we regulate this process of glycolysis? Well, first thing to recognise is you've got to have the enzymes in the correct concentration. We talked about PFK, but this applies to lactate dehydrogenase and so on. And in fact, as with PFK, we know that, for example, LDH, lactate dehydrogenase, also responds to training. And so we know that as people are exposed to this kind of training conditions, they become more efficient at converting pyruvate to lactate. But also, if you do, say, endurance training, you get the reverse. You're much better at converting lactate back to pyruvate. We'll talk about that maybe later within the course. We know that one of the key regulators is fructose 1,6-diphosphate. We're not going to dwell on that particularly. But we also know that glycolysis is inhibited under concentrations of high O2. So in other words, if O2 is readily available, that is, oxygen is readily available, then the rate of glycolysis starts to slow down. You're only going to use this substrate glycolysis, these 10 stages that we're looking at here, for the direct generation of ATP, without ATP coming from any other sources. You're only going to do this if O2 starts to become limited. Doesn't mean to say that you're not taking in oxygen. It just means that the rate that you're taking it in, the supply of oxygen, doesn't meet the demand for oxygen at the muscle, so you rely on this additional source to, in essence, supplement the generation of ATP. So those really are our key regulators. Well, what about lactate? Well, we've mentioned lactate a moment ago, and we talked about the idea that lactate is good. Well, let's just explore that. Well, lactate forms when hydrogen from the NADH combines temporarily with pyruvate. So the analogy I like to use for this, and bear with me on this one, is I want you to imagine that you're now in Tesco's. And you're in the Tesco's supermarket, and you've got a number of aisles, and you've got your shopping trolley. Now, what I want you to think about is that the shopping trolleys, your shopping trolley is a hydrogen ion. And I want you to think that the checkout is what we call NADH. It's a carrier. It's somewhere that allows you to deal with, in your case, the shopping, biologically, hydrogen ion. So if there are more counters, tills available than there are people with shopping trolleys, then we all go through, we pay our money, and we leave quite quickly. In other words, we've been processed. However, imagine what happens at Christmas. Now, at Christmas, what happens? Well, initially, you go into the store and there's never many tills open, but there's more people with shopping trolleys than there are tills. So we start to get a backlog. So we're not being processed as quickly as we need to be. So they open more tills. Now, they open more tills and the queue starts to go down, but of course it's Christmas Eve, everybody's trying to shopping, and now we get a backlog. And we get a huge backlog of people building up. And those people then start to interfere. They get very irate and they start getting angry and they're moaning because they're having to queue. And that is kind of what we're talking about here biologically. That as you're doing exercise, if it's low intensity, there's enough of these carriers to pick up the hydrogen ions, take them away from the cell, down this electron transport chain where they're used to help generate additional ATP aerobically. But under anaerobic conditions, the issue that you've got is that glycolysis is working at such a rapid rate. Just to put it in context, it's probably working at minimum 18 times quicker than it would have to work aerobically to produce the same number of ATP. So it's having to work a heck of a lot quicker to produce ATP. So you end up producing more hydrogen ions than you've got free carriers. If you haven't got enough free carriers, then what we have is we have this ability to temporarily bind hydrogen ions to pyruvate. Pyruvate absorbs them and then converts into lactate. And so what we are able to measure is we can measure it either in the muscle as lactate or in the bloodstream as a lactic acid, blood lactate. And it's an important metabolic process. As glycolysis increases even further, we produce more hydrogen ions and they more attach to pyruvate. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they all attach to pyruvate. There'll still be some that get into the muscle cell. It's not a perfect system, but a vast majority will be bound to the pyruvate molecule. Of course, if you slow down and reduce the exercise intensity, then the lactate is converted back to pyruvate, and the hydrogen ions are then repassed back to this carrier, this NADH, and then passed down the electron transport chain. So it's a very, very neat process. And if we weren't able to produce lactate, as I said earlier, you just would not be able to sustain an exercise intensity for a prolonged period of time. Okay, well, clearly we can see that we're building lactate up, and if you think back to that first graph I put up, you could see the lactate concentration is increasing. So how do you get rid of lactate? Because we all know that we may have played a game of soccer or we've done some exercise. We recognise probably the feelings of lactate building up, but we also know that it doesn't last forever, it disappears. Well, what we know is that the process, as with the restoration of PCR, the process of lactate removal is optimal under aerobic conditions. Well, that's perhaps fairly obvious now, that the only way that you're going to be able to convert lactate back to pyruvate and therefore get rid of those hydrogen ions is by having enough of those NADH carriers to pick up the hydrogen ions. That means glycolysis has to be going at a slower rate. That means it has to be occurring under aerobic conditions. As we slow the exercise intensity down, the rate of glycolysis starts to slow down, so you start to produce less hydrogen ions, which means you've got more free carriers available, which means you can convert the lactate back to pyruvate, you can release that hydrogen ion and it will attach to the free carriers. So it's all about having free NAD and free NADH. So assuming glycolysis is working at a slower rate, then we know that you'll be able to get this reattachment of hydrogens back to the free carrier and go down the electron transport chain. But what's interesting is the way muscle works. Muscle is both a producer and a consumer of lactate. Now, this is quite important because what we measure in the bloodstream when we take lactate readings, I'm sure you've all heard of people taking lactate readings, is actually lactate accumulation, and that is the difference between what is being produced by a muscle and what is being consumed by a muscle. What do we mean by that? Well, we know that the prime producers of lactate are the fast-twitch anaerobic fibres, because they don't have a lot of aerobic machinery, therefore they are rich in glycogen stores, therefore they're able to produce more lactate. Slow-twitch fibres, on the other hand, don't produce a lot of lactate, but they've got a lot of machinery available which allows them to convert lactate back to pyruvate. And by doing that, they are then able to take that pyruvate, and as you'll see in subsequent weeks, actually break that down further to generate more ATP. So muscle both consumes and produces lactate, and the balance between that production and consumption is what you see in the bloodstream. So at low intensity exercise, what we find is that there's a perfect balance between the amount being produced and the amount being consumed. But as the intensity gets even higher, we produce more than can be consumed, and so the blood lactate concentration starts to increase. So it becomes a really, really important measure for us in terms of what is going on in relation to substrate metabolism. What's left are what we call fragments, and the remaining fragments of pyruvate, which is what we get left, are then oxidized either through what's called the Cori cycle in the liver, or they will go into the next cycle of breakdown. So in the liver, pyruvate itself is able to be reconverted back to glucose. Well, let's think about that. Why is that the case? Well, we started with glucose, and all we've done is broken it down in 10 stages. So if you think back to those schematics, you'll see that the arrows were reversible. They went in both directions. So the liver is a prime site for converting pyruvate all the way back to glucose. And so you've now got free glucose again in the circulation. So it maintains our blood glucose concentration. And this whole process is very much dependent upon the amount of available oxygen that is coming to the muscle. Now, we thought a little bit about this last week in relation to PCR. But what we now know is the optimal amount of oxygen for this, to perfuse the muscle, to provide enough oxygen to create an aerobic state to allow us to convert lactate back to pyruvate, is associated with a heart rate of around about 140 to 150 beats per minute. Sounds quite high, doesn't it, as an intensity? But it's optimal for perfusing the muscle with oxygen. If it's lower than that, yes, there'll be oxygen coming in, but it's not optimal. If it's higher than that, then glycolysis, the rate of glycolysis will increase, so you'll actually start producing lactate. And very much as we talked about with PCR, the conversion of lactate is on almost the same rate. So about 50% of lactate is converted back in 1 minute, and about 80 to 85% is converted back in 6 minutes. So just to kind of summarize this part of the session, here we've got the fact that I said that glycogen or glucose is converted down to pyruvate. If it's under anaerobic conditions, you can see it goes to lactate. If it's under aerobic conditions, it goes to another cycle. The pyruvate goes into what's called the TCA cycle, which is the tricarboxylic acid cycle, with a subsequent production of CO2 and H2O. Now, we'll look at that in a subsequent visit, but the point is that the faster the rate of glycolysis, that is, the greater the amount of output that is needed at the muscle, the more pyruvate that's going to be produced, the more hydrogen ions are going to be produced, the more lactate that's going to be produced. Only when the rate of force output that's required at the muscle starts to decrease will glycolysis decrease, will pyruvate production start to decrease, will you then produce less hydrogen ions within the process, and will then have more carriers available, which allows you to then release hydrogen ions from the lactate and therefore convert the lactate back to pyruvate. Now, we saw this graph in a different guise in the previous session. The difference here is that we've increased the duration, so we're actually looking at 60 seconds of work here rather than the last one, which was 10 to 12 seconds. But notice that physiologically the processes are the same. It's still the exercise onset. We're still using ATP-PC. You can see that straight away. So this is 60 seconds of maximum intensity exercise, and you can see by the middle dotted line in the PCR, we get that very rapid fall within the first 6 to 10 seconds. And within the first 5 to 6 seconds, can you see that the DLADT, which is the glycolysis line, the red line, starts to increase quite significantly. But even after about 20 seconds, that starts to decrease. In other words, the rate at which we're producing energy starts to have a mismatch against what the actual amount of energy is that we need. So we now supplement it even further, and it's supplemented in this case by oxygen, and you can see the VO2 line, so the volume of oxygen starts to increase. But also look at the lactate. Can you see that the lactate concentration increases, and it increases initially in accordance with the increasing glycolysis. But because you're now trying to maintain the same exercise intensity, and because the PCR stores have started to decrease and have pretty much hit rock bottom, you can see now that the lactate concentration just keeps on rising and rising and rising. But because lactate's rising, that tells us we're producing more hydrogen ions. And we know that we're producing more hydrogen ions if we look at the pH. Remember I said that the hydrogen ions make the cell acidic. And you can see that the pH is starting to decrease. So the cell's becoming more acidic. And the more acidic the cell becomes, the harder it is for glycolysis to work, the harder it is for PCR breakdown to work. And so therefore, you have to increase the rate at which these processes work to compensate for it, which means that you end up producing more hydrogen ions, more lactate, and making the cell even more acidic. So you kind of get caught into this ever-decreasing circle until eventually you either stop due to volition exhaustion, or you terminate the exercise or slow down by choice. But it's a very, very neat interplay between the energy systems that you can see within this graph here. Now, I've put this on just to show you a relationship between force, a percentage of force, and then the muscle pH. So if we take a pH where we've got a normal pH, then you're able to maintain maximal force at the muscle. But can you notice that as the pH starts to fall and becomes more acidic in the cell, can you see that the amount of force that's being generated starts to decrease? So that's telling us this is in a condition where they've exposed the cell to quite acidic environments, slightly different to what we're perhaps describing in terms of substrate metabolism. But the example is spot on, that as the cell becomes more acidic, that is the pH decreases, the amount of force, peak tetanic force that's being produced at the muscle declines, and declines quite substantially. So we've only had a decrease here from about 7.1, pH of 7.1, to about 6.5, 6.4, 6.5. So it's only what's that? 7, yeah, 6 to 7 decrease in pH. Score of 6 to 7 decrease in pH. So very, very small decrease, but a significant decrease in force output. Why? Because the hydrogen ions interfere directly, if they're allowed to, with the troponin-tropomyosin complex. They reduce the number of active binding sites. If there's less binding sites between actin and myosin, then there's less force being produced at the muscle. So this is a really neat example from Spriet's group, just showing us this association between peak tetanic force and the cell's acidity. And we know that the acidity is associated with the rate at which glycolysis occurs. So glycolysis is working faster, more hydrogen ions, the cell becomes more acidic. The upshot is that it's harder to produce force. So, let's have a look then at how all this relates to football. And what do we see under football conditions in relation to glycolysis and substrate metabolism. Okay, well, here we've got some nice data from Jens Bangsbo's group a couple of years ago, and what they've got is blood lactate responses for a couple of players during the first half and second half of a game. So they've taken some just before the first half, and then what they've done is they've been able to take lactate samples every 15 minutes throughout the game. Now, what we have to be slightly careful of is that this is almost like case data, but what you can see across the board is that from the onset there is a very, very dramatic rise within the first few minutes. It doesn't matter who the individual is, you can see all of them have had a significant rise up to about 8 millimoles from a resting sample of around about 1 to 1.5 millimoles. Now, that tells us straight away that there's been a significant increase in glycolysis. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? That we talked about previously that the distance is covered 10 to 12 kilometres, that they're doing high intensity activities every 90 seconds, which have a duration of around about 2 to 4 seconds for each of those high intensity efforts. So we know that in each of those efforts, which are coming every roughly 90 seconds, there's an increase in both the use of PCR. Well, we know that's limited, which therefore means there must be an increased reliance on glycolysis. Now, what we see here is that the lactate concentration throughout the game is quite variable for individuals, but in all of them you can see that there's a decrease. So we get to the end of the first half, it decreases during the half-time period, and that's because they're getting active recovery, or I should rephrase that. There is a recovery process taking place. That is, the rate of glycolysis is starting to slow down because oxygen becomes more readily available. In other words, supply of oxygen starts to meet the metabolic demand. Because glycolysis is slowing down, they're producing less hydrogen ions, they're producing less lactate, and any lactate that was produced is now being converted back to pyruvate, with the excess hydrogen ions being passed down the electron transport chain. So we can see that that is the case. But then you can see as soon as the second half starts that there's a rise, not as dramatic as there was in the first half, but there is a rise in the lactate concentration. And interestingly, 2 of the players are showing, actually by the time they get to the end of the game, in fact this is including extra time, that there's a significant decrease in the lactate concentration. In other words, they can't sustain this work output, they can't sustain this glycolysis because the lactate and the hydrogen ions become fatiguing. That the more lactate and hydrogen ions you produce and the more acidic the cell becomes, the harder it is to generate force, the more muscle fibres you have to recruit, the more energy you use. So it starts to become very limiting. It's not that you run out of the energy, you don't run out of the carbohydrate per se, it's the fact that the hydrogen ions and the lactate start to become debilitating in many ways to the functioning of the muscle. So let's just look at this data here. Now this is quite neat. So this is muscle lactate concentration. So this is the same study, but now what we had on the previous graph was blood lactate. Now here's what they got from the muscle. Now, if you notice that what we're seeing is that it's perhaps slightly harder to read because these are individual samples taken at the different time periods, but can you see that they are following a fairly similar trend to what you saw with blood lactate? And that's why we record blood lactate samples, because we know that what we see in the blood is a fairly good reflection of what is happening in the muscle, bearing in mind that the muscle is the composite of what is being produced and what is being consumed. And as soon as you're producing more than a muscle can consume, the blood lactate concentration goes up. So the muscle lactate scores, if they're increasing, so that's the amount being produced, then the blood lactate score is also going to be increasing. And you can see, as we saw with our blood lactate, that at the end of the first half there's a decrease, then it starts to rise for the second half, but not to the same degree as we saw in the first half. So we know, and it tells us quite nicely, that the process of glycolysis that we inferred previously that we're seeing in the blood lactate, that we can see at the muscle, that this shows us the rate at which glycolysis is working. That glycolysis is working at a faster rate in the first half because we've got higher muscle lactate scores than it was in the second half. They've either slowed down because the opposition has slowed down, or more likely they've had to slow down because of some form of metabolic fatigue, because they've obviously gone quite hard in the first half compared to the second half. Now, what we've got here is pH. And so again, just bear in mind that as we start, the pH is high because we're in the resting state, but it drops very, very rapidly in the first half. And then again, can you see that it's risen again in the second half? So it's telling us that in the second half, that the rate of glycolysis was slowing down, that they were almost certainly covering less distance under anaerobic conditions. They were perhaps doing less sprints or less high intensity work, and therefore relying less on anaerobic glycolysis. They were producing less hydrogen ions, and therefore there were less hydrogen ions having to attach to pyruvate, or less hydrogen ions that were getting into the cell and interfering with the troponin-tropomyosin complex. So we can see that that is the case in this game of soccer. Now, it's quite difficult to always describe football in a systematic way, because no two games are identical. But we recognise that during a game of football there is an increased reliance on anaerobic glycolysis, and particularly in games where you've got to chase the score, then that's going to increase. Particularly in games where you're having to, if you're playing in defence and you're having to defend very hard, there's a lot of attacks coming one after the other, you're having to do multiple sprints of short duration, high intensity, then glycolysis and therefore lactate production are going to increase. And the final thing to show you really is this data, which is just looking at the lactate concentration, first half to the second half. So we've got elite versus first division, and we've got non-elite. Sorry, elite and first division versus non-elite. And can you see that both are showing exactly the same pattern? That the elite are able to produce more lactate. That means they pretty much what we talked about on previous weeks, that the elite players in total will work, an absolute intensity will be higher. The relative intensity will be the same, but the absolute intensity will be higher. They will cover more total distance, and as a percentage they'll be running at a higher speed than somebody who is non-elite. But both groups show that in the second half that there is a reduction in the amount of energy being derived from glycolysis. They are slowing down. Now, this could be the consequence of doing too much in the first half. It could be the consequence of having players who are not aerobically fit enough to provide oxygen to remove the lactate, or it could be the consequence of not having done a suitable recovery that we referred to earlier during the interval, during the rest period, to facilitate lactate removal. All of those, though, are going to contribute to less distance being covered. If they're covering less distance, then you can argue the player is physically less proficient during the second half of the game compared to the first half of the game. But quite revealing in terms of what is going on in relation to substrate metabolism. Okay, so we've had quite a good tour today in terms of the processes of glycolysis and ATP production under anaerobic conditions. And we've certainly had a good look at the way in which that process is regulated and the way in which that lactate is associated with pH and hydrogen ion concentration. So in the following session, we're going to look at what happens if the exercise intensity becomes lower and how we then start to use glucose and glycogen under aerobic conditions. Okay?